Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Perrin. I'm the Assistant Director at the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism, and I am pleased to announce our speaker for today. Evan's work today was sponsored by the Andrew Berlin, I want to say this right, the Andrew Berlin Family National Security Research Fund. Andrew Berlin established an endowment at the Maxwell School, which INSCIT is pleased to be able to administer to support national security research for faculty and PhD students. We're exceptionally lucky to sponsor Evan today, who is currently a Fulbright Presidential PhD scholar in political science at the Maxwell School. He's also, or has been a researcher for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, presently still, and he's a non-resident fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Prior to coming to Maxwell, he conducted research on defense reform, civil military relations, and regional security for numerous government agencies and research institutes. He's also taught defense economics and strategic policy. He is particularly well-traveled and well-schooled in other countries, and he has a bachelor's in political science from a university in Indonesia, a master's degree from a university in Singapore, and then a master's degree in political science here at Syracuse. So please join me in welcoming Evan.
Thank you. Let me just first say thank you to INSCIT and to the Andrew Berlin Family National Security Research Fund for supporting my fieldwork and archival research for the past year for my dissertation project. So what I'm going to present today is some of the more preliminary findings, some of the key arguments that I've been sort of developing over the past 1 or 2 years. That's part of the larger dissertation project. So today I'll speak a little bit about the dissertation project overall, some of the arguments I'm making, and I'll zero in a bit more specifically on one particular case or one particular chapter regarding the impacts of U.S. military aid, particularly with regards to education and training to Indonesia during the Cold War. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the preliminary findings and conclusions, at least from the case and some of the other cases that I've sort of reviewed in but haven't really zeroed in yet on the granular details of the empirics. So in terms of the motivating questions for the project, one is sort of more theoretical, one is sort of more empirical. On the more theoretical side, I'm trying to particularly understand why militaries change, and particularly how and why they change by adopting foreign warfighting concepts. Now, the idea about militaries adopting foreign warfighting concepts is sort of part of the larger debate from a wide range of fields, from strategic studies, IR, all the way down to military history. And the empirical side of things, I'm particularly more interested in looking at the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific is a new term. It used to be called the Asia-Pacific because now India is becoming a much larger player. They call it the Indo-Pacific, and it speaks to larger questions about the degree to which the region has been military westernized and how that affects the likelihood of conflict in the region. And it speaks to a few different literature and research programs. As you can see there, it speaks about the degree in which the third world has been militarized, how Asian security policies and how rising powers in the region sort of import their military power by borrowing military technologies and doctrine from the West. China in particular has been borrowing heavily from the European markets in recent years, Japan in the previous century, as well as India and a few others. In fact, there isn't a part of the Asia-Pacific region that hasn't had some form of military westernization in the last 100 or 200 years. So why the project matters, I set up the project to speak to a few different research programs, as I said earlier, but it also speaks to the broader sort of diffusion studies comeback in the last 10 years within the broader social sciences, from sociology, from economics, all the way down to political science. And as I'm looking at how the diffusion sort of unfold, one key mechanism I'm looking at is the ability of foreign military assistance programs in particular in terms of transporting those warfighting concepts to the region. And I asked some of the broader implications. For example, does military westernization actually provide a combat edge? Is China more likely to be an effective military just because it borrows from Europe, for example? And so the project about how states in Asia borrowed and adopted Western military ideas and doctrines have a wide range of security policy implications. So in particular, I'm looking at this one outcome of interest, which is what we call in the literature a military emulation, which is the systematic adoption or imitation of technology, structure, as well as doctrine of another state. In particular, I sort of break down the concept of emulation and look at its variation by scope, speed, and faithfulness, which is how similar you are to the original model. So if, let's say, you borrow the counterinsurgency manual from the US, to what extent did you actually borrow the full range of the doctrine, or did you just pick and choose some parts of the doctrine? And I'm trying to develop this notion that based on the wide range of things that you adopt, from technology, the structure of the institution, the techniques at the tactical level, force employment systems, and so forth, that there seems to be a spectrum between maximalist adopter or emulator all the way down to minimalist. And somewhere in the middle is kind of a mixed picture for a lot of the Asian countries because they like to borrow, for example, parts of the military technology, but not necessarily the doctrine, or they pick and choose parts of the doctrine, but not the technology. So it's sort of an ongoing effort at this point to try to pin down that variation as well. But essentially, I'm looking at the variation of military emulation at those levels of policies that are at the organizational level, not at the unit or the combat command level. So I'm looking at command and control systems, personnel planning, education and training, doctrinal and structure. And I'll speak a little bit more about some of these observable implications of emulation at those policies. So the theoretical argument right now is based on two factors. One is the nature of the transmission between the original model and the emulator, and the quality of civil military relations. The idea essentially is that if you have a higher quality of civil military relations, there's a higher likelihood that you will have a more adaptive military structure, as seen in terms of the command and level system, the education and training system, and so forth. And then I'll talk a little bit about the different types of the transmission. But the initial intuition right now is that the cooperative transmission, unlike conventional arguments I'm trying to sort of speak to, is actually the least effective in terms of transferring warfighting concepts compared to the coercive and commercial. So these are the three types of transmissions that I'm looking at. As you can see, on the left side, I divided between cooperative, coercive, and commercial, and it's based on the nature of the relationship between the innovator and the emulator. In particular, I'm not looking at the fusion or emulation that doesn't happen without the direct interaction between the innovator and the emulator. So when China learned some of the lessons from the first Gulf War, I don't consider that as diffusion. I consider that as indirect diffusion because that's learning through other means without direct contact with the original model. So I'm looking at, in particular, only those diffusion or emulation that happens with the direct contact between the original model and the emulator. On the cooperative side of things, I define it as a voluntarily agreed upon mechanisms between two parties. So it's usually based on political negotiation. And because of that, the primacy of the transfer process has to do more about how good is the bilateral relations. And so they're less focused on whether or not you actually adopt parts of the doctrine, whether or not you actually do it successfully, because what matters for them is the nature of the bilateral relationship. And then for the coercive, what matters is what the occupier generally needs. So because it's done coercively and you impose the warfighting concept and system to the emulator, it's more likely that the needs of the emulator are taken into account. So in this sense, oftentimes the organizational history or the operational demands of the emulator are sidelined to make way for the demands of the occupier. And then on the commercial side of things, it's based on the market-driven logic. So essentially, you pick and choose from the shelf what you can get. And in this sense, it is the needs and the requirements of the emulator, because they have the resources to shop around and because they have a particular need, it's more likely that they could go a long way in terms of achieving that maximalist spectrum end of the emulation spectrum. So on the civil military relations side, it's important for two reasons. One is the infrastructure of the institution in terms of the learning capacity, but also the extent to which it provides resources. The premise is that high quality civil military relations, there's a higher chance that you'll be focusing on external defense rather than internal security. And in times of external defense related issues, the spending on external defense would be higher, and which sort of facilitate the process of adopting foreign systems. So this is the research design. I'll speak a little bit more on the Cold War Indonesia, but essentially the project compares Meiji Japan, British India, and Cold War Indonesia. I select the cases based on a few criteria, some theoretical, some empirical, and then I employ comparative historical analysis to sort of get at some of the cross-case comparison at the regional level, which is between different countries in the region, which transmission pathway is more likely to be effective? Is it coercive? Is it commercial? Is it cooperative? And then to get at some of the within case or at the national level variance, at what point is one particular country more likely to have effective emulation? I use some process tracing, and at least for the Indonesia case, there's some statistical analysis as well, and I'll talk about that later on. Essentially, the data is collected to archival research, some field work, and some secondary data. Those are the research side in the UK, in the US, in Indonesia, as well as Australia. And I'm collecting in particular training manuals, educational textbooks, government documents, and so forth. Right now, I'm done with the Japan case. I'm done with the data collection, about 90% for the India case, which is roughly about 15,000 pages worth of archival materials. And then the Indonesia case is still ongoing right now. I'm heading back to Indonesia in early May to wrap it up by August, hopefully. So I'll speak a bit more about the case on the case of U.S.-Indonesia military relationship. In particular, I'm looking at how U.S. education and training programs during the Cold War affected those foreign policies within the Indonesian Army. There's a whole empirical debate about why I'm focusing on the Army and not the Navy and Air Force, which I'll go into if you want me on. But essentially, the focus on the Army is because the majority of the recipient during the Cold War was the Army, and it is the largest service within the military up until today. So it has a particular importance for the military institution as a whole. So to look at the conceptual influence from the U.S. side, to how Indonesia sort of employed force, I do a systematic content analysis of some of the educational textbooks from 1950 up the way to 1982 was the latest educational textbooks. Right now, I have, let's say, about 60% of the complete series. Every 4 or 5 years, they reissue the educational textbook, the warfighting manuals, and so forth. So it's not done yet. And then I do a statistical test of a unique data set right now I'm developing with the National University of Singapore that actually tracks the career patterns and educational patterns of about 6,000 Army Academy graduates. The Indonesian military, about 90% of the Academy graduates always reach the officer corps, despite the fact that we actually admit more people from the NCO track and not the Academy track. But the Academy graduates are always more prominent for leadership positions and all that. And so to look at the organizational and the professional impact of U.S. education programs, I'm looking at those career patterns. I'll talk about the data later on. And it's also possible I might compare the effects of U.S. military aid to Indonesia with Australia's military aid to Indonesia after the Cold War. The data is sort of complete from the Australian side, but because the way it's structured, they target very differently the Indonesian Army officers than the U.S. one. So I'm not sure yet about the basis of comparison. So the policy focus of the chapter on Indonesia is essentially developing a policy framework in which we can assess how and under what conditions military education and training programs can be effective from the perspective of the recipient's need, in particular, its organizational and operational requirements. In particular, I'm looking at those three policy areas, which I believe to determine the effectiveness of foreign education programs. One is operational congruence. So it's not necessarily the cultural gap that matters between Western ideas or doctrines with Asian ones. It's more about to what extent does the operational demand of the institution receiving it matches with what's being transferred. So there was a point in the 1960s up in the 70s, US was very much keen in providing point training and civic action training, which fit perfectly with the Indonesian military's operational demands. But in the 80s and 90s, when Indonesia was trying to move away from an internal security-based military into an external defense, the persistent patterns of US military education sort of got stuck in the same old pattern. So there was a growing mismatch in that sense. And the second part has to do with the institutionalization of the personnel system. In particular, I'm trying to understand when and how particular ranks and particular positions of the recipients actually matters for whether or not the programs are effective. So if, let's say, you went to the US for education and training when you were a colonel or lieutenant colonel, I argue is actually less effective for the institution because the basis of education and training and how their military mindset has been sort of established would not be washed off in 1 year worth of staff and command college at, say, at Fort Leavenworth. So the rank and position in which they departed to the US mattered, but the rank and position in which they return also mattered. Most of the time, after their return, they get demoted or they get stuck in their old position without any relevant postings. And for emulation, I argue that for the US military systems to have any effect, those who came back should be assigned to education and training posts, personnel planning, and operations. If you're not posted in these three positions, then there's less likely that you'll sort of use what you learn in the US in your daily job in a way that matters for the institution as a whole. And whether or not there's a transparency within the personnel system also matters because if you leave the country for a year or two and there's no transparency in terms of expectations, what your next ranking or your next position would be, there's less likely that you'll be incentivized to do well in your training, or there's less incentives for the best and brightest to come and join these education and training programs because when you come back, your career sort of takes a hit. And finally, in terms of defense resource, in particular about personnel benefits that I think is tied to the incentives to enroll in U.S. education and training systems. Because the way the budget system works for the military in Indonesia, your base salary never changes for a long time depending on your rank, but it's the added benefits that sort of at one point can be even twice as much as your actual salary. So if you go overseas, or actually if you go to any educational assignments as a student, those benefits are usually cut. So your base salary becomes incredibly low and your income becomes incredibly low. So the resource aspect of the personnel benefits affects the incentives to be part of these education systems. So the intuition is that for this particular case, at least, a maximalist emulation is more likely to be effective when you target them at the academy level, so lower ranked. That the people who return are then promoted and positioned into the key posts. That the program overall is not broken halfway. So, for example, it would be nice to have a consistent program over the span of 15, 20 years rather than 2 years and then break for 3 years and then resume again. That consistency, I think, matters because of the generational transfer of knowledge within the military as you go. One of the key arguments that was made after 9/11 and the Bali bombing in 2002 for the U.S. to resume military cooperation with Indonesia was that there was a lost generation who hadn't experienced U.S. military training for over a decade. So when the U.S. military from the Pacific Command tried to find people to work with on counterterrorism, they just couldn't find people that they could work with because who had been to the U.S. So that part about the sustainability of the programs actually mattered. So as I said earlier, I'm looking at the organizational impacts. I'm using career pattern data. This is kind of like how the data looks like. It's coding for individuals for each academy class. At the individual level, there's information about personal bio from religion, ethnicity to its education in particular. I think that matters. So, for example, whether or not you're educated in the US, does that have an effect to your career patterns and so forth? And whether or not you have a civilian undergraduate degree or not should matter for your career. And then the kinds of specialized military courses, certain types of professional military education, both Indonesia as well as overseas. And then what kind of assignments and duties do you get? Do you get assigned to intelligence unit, special forces, support logistics, strike forces? What kind of campaigns and duties you get? And then aside from the individual data, I also create the aggregate data for each class. So in each class, I can, for example, class of 74, I can think of ways that, let's say, 40% of class of 74 went to the US, and out of that 40%, 90% went on to become military leaders in the education and training system. And these are the kinds of patterns that I'm trying to understand from this aggregate and individual level data. And then for the archival data, these are some of the OCR stuff that I have to sort of collect, and then they're all in digital format right now. Right now, I'm also converting them into OCR text, so I can just use Atlas TI or the others to do some content analysis. Most of the stuff that I got right now is from the US side, from the National Archives, from the Hoover Institution, from the Library of Congress, mostly between the 1950s up to the 1970s. I have some FOIA requests pending right now, about 25 FOIA requests. For the last 9 months, I've gotten one, which is not bad, I guess, considering FOIA usually takes 3 years. But the FOIA request was really worth it because it actually detailed some of the appendix about military assistance programs, which I think hasn't been looked at. And then from the Indonesian side, and this is where the software becomes tricky because Indonesian spelling and language grammar change between before I was born and after I was born. In the 60s up until the mid 80s, they have a different language structure and wording. And then after the 90s, they have a fully formalized national Indonesian structure. So I don't know how I'm going to code at the software yet, but I might have to go through this one by one on the archival. Some of them, I'm lucky enough, has been translated into English, which helps with the content analysis. But this is probably like 10% of the entire stuff that I'm looking at. Most of it are still in Indonesian, and some of the doctrinal concepts, because we are rooted in a very old tradition, I guess, on the military, half of the concepts are in Javanese, which makes it even worse because half of them is Sanskrit Javanese. I understand what it means, but I don't think the software knows what it means. So I have to retranslate some of these documents into either a coded Indonesian language or English. So this might take a while. But essentially, some of the preliminary findings from all three cases, from some of the Indonesian cases, at least when it comes to adopting foreign, or in this case, Western warfighting concepts, we always hear the argument that history matters for the region, history matters. But my point is that in terms of warfighting, because what matters is the personnel and not necessarily the technology, the personnel policy and the structure of the institution actually provides sort of intergenerational transfer of mechanisms in terms of how they adopt foreign warfighting concepts. So they provide the underlying notion of how history matters when we think about when and how the region can experience conflict in the future. And then for the cooperative transmission, for me at least, based on the Indonesian case and some of the other cases, I've reviewed briefly. The cooperative one, again, is least effective just because the details are less important for the negotiating parties. And this is confirmed from various interviews I had with the US Embassy office in Jakarta, in which they say basically what they do is that they come to the Indonesian Defense Ministry and say, look, for the next budget cycle, we have $15 million. $15 million can go to about 15 classes, which can give us 25 people. Come give us 25 people. On the Indonesian military side, okay, so guys, we have 25 openings. Who wants to join up? No one? Okay, fine, we'll assign randomly. So the way that the substance and the content of the program sort of dismissed and more about we need to spend the budget, we need to maintain good relations, and we need to expand the level of military engagement, I think takes precedence over the content. But it's also kind of impossible to say that there's no effect whatsoever. Anecdotal evidence suggests historically they matter. In the 1950s, for example, the first batch of Indonesian Army colonels and lieutenant colonels who went to West Point for Leavenworth and so forth actually came home with a few boxes of the training manuals they got from West Point and Fort Leavenworth, and was ordered to be translated to be used in our military academies. I haven't quite seen the boxes, so I really want to. But right now, there's some anecdotal evidence to suggest that they may have mattered to some extent in terms of some of the more hardcore military stuff, like tactical or some military engineering stuff at the academy level. But at the staff and command college level, it doesn't seem to be particularly important. But I'm not sure yet. It's not confirmed. But my intuition is that the cooperative one, because of the nature of the bilateral relationship that takes precedent, I think is least effective compared to the coercive and commercial. And therefore, when we design foreign military assistance programs, particularly to education and training, it's not just about necessarily finding a common issue area in which the US is willing to train and the recipient needs the training, but also the extent to which we should consider their idea of promotion policies and institutional structure, and how do we target which part of the command structure we want to bring into training. So in the case of the Asia Pacific, I want to say that military technology from the West does provide a signaling effect for the rest of the region in terms of armament. So right now, the influx of military technology into the region has been really high for the last 10 years. But the actual combat power generation depends more on the force employment system of the institutions rather than the technology per se. So we should be careful about assigning assumptions of deterrence or motives about a likelihood of conflict with China just based on spending on military technology alone without taking into account how the structure of the institution manages its manpower. And finally, the force employment system that's adopted, um, yes, the adoption matters, but the use of the new force employment system in military operation often depends on the structure of the institution as well. So in terms of personnel benefits, in terms of assessment systems and so forth. So the dissertation doesn't really look into detail. Can you actually effectively use a force employment system that's borrowed from other countries? But it has implications about when and how can we think about to what extent can they actually use it. So I'm looking into some of the operational history, at least for Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, India in some of the Marathas War, and maybe World War I, and Indonesia during the East Timor campaign. But I'm not yet establishing a direct relationship between the extent to which you adopt versus the extent to which you become militarily effective. I think that's a separate but important question that I'll probably explore later on. Thank you. And if there's any questions, yes.
I have two questions. One is to do with the theoretical structures that you're using, the other to do with the claims you're making on the basis of the empirics that you've done so far.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to the larger theoretical structure, can you say a little bit about why you excluded what you're describing as indirect, but in some circumstances it appears to be, could be pretty direct, channels for particularly great power to great power diffusion. So the literature that some of the literature that you juxtaposed, that you cited earlier in your talk, thinking in particular of Rosende Santos, but others, is about states banging into each other. When they bang into each other, demonstrating what they've done, what they have, and then other states, either because they're the target or because they're watching, figuring out what's going on. But that scenario appears to be excluded from the channels that you're showing here. So can you say a little bit about why that is? And the other thing is that let me hold my second question for you.
Okay. So 2 points about the exclusion of the learning through combat engagement. So first of all, because of the nature of the empirical cases within Asia, so that's the first limiting scope. There aren't that many great powers to begin with in Asia, but that's neither here nor there. I guess because the theory was designed to explain how great powers learn from each other, I felt that there are some scope conditions of the theory that may not apply for the region I'm looking at. But the second part is because adoption or emulation through combat has to account for other factors like the duration of the conflict, the type of conflict, the extent of weaponry used, and there are a million other factors I feel that explains the likelihood of learning from the enemy without actually directly taking the blueprint from the enemy. So you may misinterpret the lessons that you learn. You may actually just observe some of the employments of tank warfare, but not really understanding how they came up with it in the first place. So I'm trying to exclude some of those complicating factors of perception about learning, and therefore I only zero in from those who actually sort of see the fusion as a process idea between the original model and the emulator. So that's kind of where the theoretical concepts sort of move away from the combat part.
So I think that's great, and I think that's the way you've just described that convinces me. But I think you might want to actually say that, explain the scope conditions more up front as to why you're building on but not necessarily drawing from the literature. Actually, talking about the indirect one, the Confucian aspect of this, which actually does reference Asia. Exactly 20 years ago, Brian and I shared an office with Tom Mankin, who was writing a book about Japan, and he explained how some Japanese naval scientists visited England and mistakenly believed that England had developed an oxygen-driven torpedo, which they hadn't. But they returned to Japan and told Japanese scientists, "Oh, England's got an oxygen-driven torpedo, so it must be possible. We must build one too." And they built one, and it was the best torpedo during the second. It was the most effective torpedo, and it was faux diffusion. But it's an example of how you're right, that people get the wrong end of the stick, and that's obviously an extreme case. My other question has to do with the claim you make in the conclusion about comparison.
Yeah.
Specifically in the context of the Indonesian case, where's the comparison with the other two mechanisms? This isn't the Indonesian case almost wholly cooperative. So how are you able to make comparisons with the coercive and commercial pathway arguments?
So right now I'm trying to break down the specific mechanisms for each of the transmissions. So between, let's say, comparing foreign military assistance programs that's part of the cooperative transmission, and comparing that with limited training provided by the East India Company during British colonial times, and measure and think about which one is more effective at actually imparting their particular warfighting concept. So in the actual chapters, I hope to actually flesh out the specific mechanisms for each of the transmission, and then see that particular transmission, see if it's more or less effective compared to the cooperative transmission in a different case. So right now, the comparison between the three countries only lies at the transmission part and not at the quality of civil-military relations. So the comparison is only if Japan learned about Western military warfighting concepts commercially versus Indonesia learning it through foreign military assistance programs, which one of these two a transmission is more effective at actually allowing the process of emulation to take place. So I think that's going to be made explicit later on, but the idea is to compare the different transmission and how that affects the likelihood of effectiveness of emulation. Yeah.
I have a series of questions, and
Sure.
you'll have to take some of these with a grain of salt because I'm not as familiar with your project as some other members of the audience are. So just a kind of basic couple of questions, I guess. How do you sort out effectivity if you're doing basically doctrinal analysis and you're excluding the combat unit level integration of any of these concepts?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make sort of intuitive sense to me how that can work. A second set of questions is about this descriptor Westernization, your notion of militarily Westernized concepts.
Yep.
I couldn't help thinking, and again, part of this is we just had a visitor yesterday, an Indonesian lieutenant colonel.
Yeah.
I don't know if you met with him.
I was supposed to, but because I wasn't about to come to Syracuse until yesterday, we couldn't meet. Yeah, but yeah, I had some exchanges.
So he's an Eisenhower fellow, you might know that program.
Yeah.
So in some way, he's wrong historical period, right, for what you're doing, but he's kind of an example of this military to military, potentially, training and personnel infusion process.
Right.
And he had very interesting things to say about what I would term adaption instead of adoption. I mean, and why can't we talk about some of these concepts in those terms? And is it useful to think about them in those terms? And one other point about this guy that I thought was interesting. So his first contribution, I think when he was a captain, was to develop an IHL manual, an International Humanitarian Law film and manual.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he told me when I asked him why he did this, because it struck me as very interesting that you would try to train your comrades in terms of a film, right? And this was what, 10 or 12 years ago that he made this movie. And he said that he had kind of taken advantage of international law, of IHL, and realized that there were some norms here that were really important. And he was also thinking about this in terms of the pre-Suharto, post-Suharto kinds of political dynamics. Mm-hmm. And that he felt that to really get people to implement this or to start changing, internalizing things, maybe that's the way to put it, he needed a film, but a book or a brochure or a manual wouldn't do it. And so I think this speaks to this adoption versus adaptation thing that I'm trying to get at, and that where you might see that, where the evidence of that might be, and it might not be just at the doctrinal level. So.
Yeah, thank you. I'll respond in reverse, I guess, because it's probably easier to talk from the international humanitarian law aspect that you mentioned. So right now, I didn't plan this, but when I went to the field since November, I discovered that actually, aside from observing the behavior of the military in terms of operations, and see if they adopted sort of Western tactical systems and so forth, the other way is to look at the rules of engagement. What kind of rules that they put in place to measure the behavior, right? There's two types, right? One is more sort of the political type of behavior, like can you run for office if you're a general? And the other one is sort of more the operational side of rules of engagement. Turns out we've never had engagement coded and codified from the entire history of the military. So the way that we think about rules of engagement are ad hoc. So it depends on, let's say, the campaign is in East Timor, then who's ever in charge of that campaign sets the rules of engagement.
But that's always
Right, but what some of us in the past were trying to get at was how can we make the rules of engagement to be part of national law? So drawing from international humanitarian law, can we make rules of engagement as part of the military law so that it forces them to reform the military justice system and so forth? But obviously, there's resistance to that effect. But because of the absence of a operational rules of engagement, whether it's at the national law level or even at the presidential decree level, the military practically has authority to interpret whatever commands are given, right, by the president, which includes operational details. So if there is a violation, let's say some, violence or uncondoned assassinations in particular conflict areas, we have no rules of engagement to hold them accountable to, other than whatever the rules that the commander has set for them. So when I was trying to go through this, I was trying to wonder, well, if there's a way for us to understand a series of these sort of campaign-specific or task force-specific rules of engagement, then maybe we can have a better sense as well whether or not the U.S. education system also has influence with regards to rule creating. Because rule creating is one way to understand the concepts beyond the doctrinal level, right? And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, but it's been really hard. Some of the more classified ones I can probably get, but I can never write about because it's still within the time frame of 25 years. Although I doubt they'll check Cambridge University Press a journal article, see if they have anything on it. But so I'm trying to think about the rules of engagement part seriously beyond the doctrinal level, and what types of regulations do they use to guide behavior, and whether or not those regulations are influenced some form or the other to international humanitarian law training, because in the last 15 years, there were influences. I think Mercy Corps did some training, the Red Cross did some training, and I think this mention of film is actually particularly important because there's no documentary paperwork to speak of. So I think that provides the sense of effectiveness as well, because all you got to do is just arrange a joint film session essentially to sort of talk about these issues without saying, hey, these are the rules and then you have to follow them. And I think that's where I'm trying to get at beyond sort of the doctrinal level. Excluding the combat level, and I think this is where I wanted to know more as well about the rules of engagement part, because the rules of engagement, if it's combat specific and it's campaign specific, then it will regulate sort of the more tactical units rather than the broader institution beyond the doctrine, and trying to sort of contrast between what the doctrine actually says at the institutional level versus the rules of engagement may get you at sort of the more nuanced gaps or differences between the effects of military adoption from the US versus local requirements or ad hoc intuition from the commander and so forth. And I think this is hopefully what I can try to get at more as I go back. And to be honest, I've also been struggling with the particular terminologies between adoption, adaptation, innovation, emulation. And I sort of set on diffusion as a process in which the presence of diffusion is measured by the presence of emulation, mainly because I felt the adaptation part is partial, at least in the literature, it's sort of responding to particular circumstances, and the changes are partial to that particular circumstances. So adaptation during the East Timor campaign, which was quite famous, at least the story goes, is that we had borrowed from, I think it was from the 101st Airborne Division to do parachute jumping for the launch of the invasion. And we sort of borrowed willy-nilly and we messed it up because we didn't have the proper guidance for the pinpoint of the location and so forth. And we sort of adapted that particular thing that we learned from the Airborne Division to sort of more, okay, next time when we do these jumpers, make sure we have some torches light up at the runway, stuff like that. So that for me, that's adaptation and not at the organizational level. Whereas emulation, I feel is a bit broader, and that's sort of what I'm trying to get at. But yeah, I think you're right that there is more fine-grained nuance in terms of the behavior beyond the doctrinal level that I need to get at. And hopefully one way to get it is through these rules of engagement stuff, which may or may not happen depending on whether or not I get access to it. Oh, sorry.
No, that's. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.